know Mike's around. He's probably changing a diaper or getting Grace somewhere. So, all right. So, would any of you like to open us in prayer? The fact that Mike runs by with a diaper is fantastic.
Oh, that set it off perfect.
All right. Well, you are all capable of praying. You are all encouraged to pray, but I'll open us today. If you'll join with me. God, thank you. Thank you for the blessing of this day. As we're still getting used to what it looks like to be in our homes and sheltered from everything else, may we continue to smile. Whether it be new puppies or dirty diapers or eating dinner really fast. God, you have given us some amazing gifts. So thank you. May we take the time tonight to just enjoy learning to get to know about you. It's in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so today we were going to jump into Mark chapter 2, kind of 2, 3, just looking at that. So did anyone, any kind of start off questions that anyone had or curiosities before we dig in?
I actually had a question on, it was in chapter 2,
Okay.
in regards to when Jesus was being questioned about fasting. And
okay.
the way that was worded, I probably read it 4 or 5 times, and I still just I need a little bit of help understanding. That one kept going over my head.
Yeah. All right. So let's kind of step through, and because that's kind of the second half of the chapter, let's look at the first half.
Okay.
And we'll get to that one. So it starts off with Jesus healing this paralytic man. Now, maybe you've seen the image or read the story before of these friends that take their paralyzed friend to go see Jesus. There's such a big crowd. Dominic, remember we were talking at the end last time about how at the end of chapter 1, now the crowds are so big he can't go into the towns and things. Yep. So the crowd's so big, people can't even get into the house. And so the friends take him, open up the roof. It's not like our houses that have, all these different layers. It's just a thatch kind of roof, adobe, mud, thatch. So they open it up, lower Jesus, and when he gets there, Jesus notices the Pharisees are thinking poorly about him. It's not even that they're saying anything, they're just thinking it. And Jesus says, well, what's harder, to forgive his sins or to heal his body? So Jesus forgives this paralytic man's sins, and that's where the Pharisees get all upset. Only God can forgive sins. Well, that's kind of the whole point. And then he says, well, what's easier, to forgive sins or to heal the man's body? And he tells the man, get up and walk, and he goes home. And then it quickly jumps to, now he goes outside and they start to head to the sea, and he passes this guy named Levi, who's a tax collector. Does anyone know what one of the other gospel accounts, what they call him, what his name is? You know it. All of you know it. So his Hebrew name is Levi. His Greek name is Matthew.
Okay.
So in the Gospel of Mark, it talks about this guy named Levi. Gospel of Matthew, it talks about this guy named Matthew. It's the same guy. Sort of be like if, do any of you have a nickname that you go by? Hey, when you're with this group of friends, they all call you this name. Jake? No, they just call me Jake.
I mean, I'm familiar with the concept.
The idea. Yeah. And that's exactly what's going on here, is that you have all these people who speak Aramaic, so they would call him Levi, and then you have all these people who are speaking Greek and Latin, so they're going to call him Matthew. So it's same guy, 2 different names. So he calls Matthew, calls Levi to be his disciple. He follows him, and they actually go to his house that night, and they're eating dinner, and some of the other Pharisees are grumbling because he's eating at a sinner's house. Levi was a tax collector. Now, have you heard of tax collectors before in Scripture?
Yes.
Like, you've heard tax collector come up before?
Yeah, it's always in a negative connotation.
Yeah. Do any of you know why it would be in a negative connotation? Or you?
Because they're essentially taking, the monies from the less fortunate that really may not have the extra money, and a lot of times profiting off of it.
Okay, so we hear somewhat like Zacchaeus talks about how he's a tax collector that Jesus interacts with later. Talks about, if I've ever wronged anybody, I'll pay it back. So, Jeremy, there is that idea of sometimes they're kind of stealing money.
It's like skimming off the top. Like you owe $500 and I'll take 50 of that and turn the 450 in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of that skimming off the top. That's a great illustration. But there's also something that we miss in here that we don't get because it just doesn't make sense to us. So the Jewish people are, they're the ones who live in this region, but who are the ones who are in control of the region? What empire is in control?
Roman?
Yeah, the Roman Empire is in control. So who are they paying taxes to?
Caesar.
Yeah, they're paying them to Caesar. They're paying them to Rome. And so the tax collectors are Jewish guys who are collecting money for this foreign ruler. So they're working for the enemy. So that's another whole layer that sometimes, because we don't experience that here. We're thankful for the people who work at H&R Block because then I don't have to try to figure out all the taxes. But for these guys, like Levi, someone that's looked down on because he's working for the enemy. So he's a traitor, and yet Jesus would call this traitor to come follow him. So it's a pretty big, significant move that Jesus is talking to someone you wouldn't expect and want him to be his follower. So then we get in where Jeremy was kind of jumping to. Now, John's disciples, the Pharisees, were fasting. People came and said to Jesus, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" So there's a couple things in there. We're talking about a lot of different disciples. Disciples of John, disciple of the Pharisees, disciples of Jesus. I thought just Jesus had disciples. So what are these different disciples?
Is it just like friends almost, like just people that you're around that you kind of hang out with?
Entourage.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Kind of loosely used disciples.
Followers of followers, right? Because the disciples would go out and spread the word. So John has created his own following based off of his teaching, his interaction with Jesus.
So I like the image of the entourage. I think that's a great one. But think of if the entourage is following this one guy because this one guy's teaching them stuff. Did you ever watch the show Entourage?
I have not.
No? None of you have? Okay. So, but the whole idea is that there's this one guy they all kind of are following. They're all in together because one of them's kind of the leader. Maybe it's they're rich, they're wealthy. Here, it's because it's the teacher. There's John the Baptist has followers. The Pharisees have followers. And now Jesus has followers. So that's what a disciple is. It's a follower. Okay. But then there's this weird thing that this group's fasting, but you're not fasting. What is it? What is fasting?
Going without.
Yeah, they're going without. What are they going without of?
I would assume food.
Yeah, so that they're abstaining from eating. Maybe it's for it's the Sabbath. Maybe it's for kind of a religious holiday, or there are lots of people who talk about, we fast so that our minds can be sharpened, so we can focus on our faith. Those are all different reasons to fast. And so they're asking, John the Baptist followers are fasting, and the Pharisees followers are fasting. Fasting is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Well, why would these other followers of faith be fasting? Well, it's so that they could be sharpened in their faith, so they could focus on God. That's kind of the purpose of fasting. Sort of like we just finished out the season of Lent. In Lent, a lot of people give up something. Have any of you ever done that?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So the idea of giving something up for Lent is actually so that when you go to, let's say you gave up chocolate. When you go to eat a piece of chocolate, oh, nope, you remember that you've given that up. And so that every time you reach for that piece of chocolate, you're reminded of God. It pulls you into thinking about God. Maybe you gave up beer. Every time at the end of the night you want a beer, it's pulling you to like, nope, God sacrificed himself. This sacrifice, while it's nothing compared to Jesus, gives me the opportunity to dwell on God. Instead of having a beer, I get to think about God. So that fasting idea is sharpening your faith. All right, so if John's disciples are sharpening their faith, Pharisees are sharpening their faith, why wouldn't Jesus' disciples need to be sharpening their faith?
Maybe because they're around Jesus and he is continuously maybe teaching them and having them go out and kind of help others and help spread the word about him and God.
Well, and Jake, you're right there. But one of I'm gonna go even more basic things is if, like during Lent, we give up something, and when we crave it, it makes us think about, and hopefully it causes us to pray and to talk with God, right? That's John's disciples are fasting so that they're drawn closer to God. Pharisees are fasting so they're drawn closer to God. Jesus' disciples, do they need to fast in order to be close to God? Think real basic.
No.
No. Why?
Because they're sitting right next to him.
Yeah, because they're sitting right next to him. So why do I need to fast when I'm right here with him? I already am in close with him. So Jake, you're right. It's Jesus is teaching them, and he's with them, and he's encouraging them. But it's not just that he's teaching them, it's that he's God. That the whole idea of fasting to get closer to God, well, they're with him. So why do they need to fast right now? And Jeremy, you asked kind of in this weird illustration about this bridegroom and, the cloth and the garment and the wineskins and all of that. Is that kind of where your question was?
Yeah, and I think that just having you unpack that a little bit about the whole, I guess I wasn't really focusing enough on what the whole concept of fasting truly was about. So it's like, as I'm reading that, I'm kind of like, okay, I mean, what's the symbolism that I'm missing with the references that they're making between the bridegroom or then with the wineskins, or I wasn't connecting the dots, but now it makes a lot more sense now that we kind of unpacked it a little bit.
Well, yeah. And so, I mean, like the bridegroom is Jesus, if you celebrate with the bridegroom when he's with you. When the bridegroom and his bride go away, that's when you can be sad that the party's over. But while he's there, it's time to party. So while God is with them, why would they fast?
Yeah.
Then that illustration of, the shrunken cloth and old garments, and why would we take this old practice and try to connect it to this fact that God's with us right now? And you can't do it. It'll end up destroying it all. Same with an old wineskin. Culturally, we don't use wineskins. So they would use like the stomach of a sheep. And when it was still really pliable and fresh is when they would fill it with the wine and it would ferment in there, and then they'd have the bag. Well, when that bag was empty, what do you think would happen if they put new wine that's going to ferment in it?
Be good.
It's not that it wouldn't be good. Have any of you ever made wine or beer? All right, Jake, you have. So I've made wine. Jake, did you make wine or beer?
It was wine.
Okay, so what happens, you put the yeast, you put the grapes in, all of that stuff. What happens?
After a couple weeks, it does a whole lot of bubbling.
Yeah, it's fermenting, right? And it bubbles up. So what do you think would happen? All right, so if the wine's gonna ferment in a fresh kind of soft bag, well, it'll kind of balloon up with it, right? Now, what if that bag is older and is dried out a little bit? What's going to happen, Dominic, if it starts to ferment in there then?
It's going to start leaking. Right.
It's going to leak and it's going to pop the bag. It's going to pop the sheep's stomach. Hey, Paul.
Sorry about being late. I totally lost track of time.
No worries. So we're in Mark chapter 2. We're just talking about this idea of fasting, and then the illustrations of these wine skins, and so Jesus again is saying, don't take this old practice and try to put it when you have God with you right now, because it'll just mess it up. It'll just destroy it. Just like to try to put this new thing in an old wine skin will destroy it. So then the end of the chapter, it's on the Sabbath, and the disciples are walking around, they're plucking heads of grain, they're eating them. Pharisees say you're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath. All right, there's a whole lot in that. Why would that be working on the Sabbath? What do you think?
Well, you're technically harvesting some grain, right?
Yeah. So, all right. So, Paul, we're going to come right back to that. So, what's the Sabbath?
The day of rest.
Yeah, it's a day of rest. So God created everything in the 6 days, and on the seventh day He rested, and He gave this, and He called His people to take the seventh day and to rest, to recuperate, to relax, to worship. But worship is not actually in most of the Old Testament. Worship isn't done just on the Sabbath. Worship is done kind of all the time. And the Sabbath was this day of rest, and you weren't supposed to be doing things. All right. So that was God's instruction. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy, rest on the Sabbath day. So why would the Pharisees say that plucking heads of grain is working? Paul, what do you mean by it's essentially harvesting?
Well, you're putting an effort to harvest the grain from the where it's naturally at, right? So you're technically working.
Well, all right. So if we're walking down a field, and the wheat's grown up pretty high, and we're just you got the munchies, and so we're just taking the tops, and you're just kind of munching on them. Is that harvesting? To any of us, do we think that that's really harvesting?
No.
Not really.
No, it's not really harvesting. But the Pharisees have set up these laws around these laws, around these laws, around these laws to keep that kind of central thing so that no one can touch it. The Pharisees have set up extra laws. And so they set up these weird qualifications so if you're plucking a head of grain, you're harvesting, like Paul said. But then for you to chew the grain, what's your teeth doing? It's crunching on the grain, right? And so the chaff or the shuck, the outside of the grain, gets pulled off, and then you eat it. Well, when you're actually like fully harvesting grain, you cut it all down, and then you put it on the thrashing floor, which is you kind of grind it up and you toss it up in the air, and the wind blows away kind of the chaff and the outside of the grain. So Pharisees are saying to pluck the grain means you're harvesting and you're thrashing and you're cooking it because you're going to eat it. That's ridiculous. I mean, like, that's absolutely ridiculous. And they call Jesus out and say, you're breaking the Sabbath. And he responds with, well, David did it, and he was respected and glorified. And the Son of Man's even greater than David. And then he does this thing that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's kind of a really interesting thought. When you guys hear that, what kind of comes to mind? Jeremy, what kind of comes to mind when you hear that phrase, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath?
It makes me think about the fact that the Sabbath obviously was created before man. So it was created, and then it was for man. And it just kind of shows for me, the thought of the logic of free will kind of came into it. Like, we're all born with free will and being able to, I mean, for me, it was, you can apply the Sabbath however, it is most appropriate to you and what that means to you, as long as you're worshiping.
Okay.
I kind of look at it as God's saying you can have a day off, but it doesn't have to be a law. You don't have to have the day off. It's there if you want it. But if you need to eat, if you need to do something, that's okay too. It doesn't have to be this law that's punishable by death almost if you do anything. Because that comes later on. They wanted to kill Jesus just because he was working on the Sabbath. So I just look at it like that. It's an option. I made the Sabbath day for you. If you want to rest, that's why it's there.
Okay. Jake, Paul, Mike, any other thoughts?
I was thinking about the law aspect of it. When God created the Sabbath, it was again to rest, and it wasn't intended to be twisted into a law with a bunch of other rules. I mean, it just grew to something much greater than what it was originally intended for.
Paul, you had started to say something too.
It was going to be almost the same thing. If it seems like the rules that they were putting in place are kind of ridiculous, or I think he was kind of calling those out.
Yeah. Mike, you want to throw in any other thought?
I kind of went to, like, we need the Sabbath, but the Sabbath doesn't need us. Like, our body, our souls need the day, to rest, to worship, to do whatever. But the Sabbath would and will go on if man was not here.
Okay. All right. So I think all of you brought up really interesting points, and I think it's intriguing how each of you took it. When I read it, I hear a little bit of all of what you said. The Sabbath was made for man, that God gave this day of rest, I think, like Mike said, because our bodies, our souls need it. Dom, you brought up, if you need a day off, here it is. And there's just that beautiful element of God gave us the Sabbath so that we could be replenished. We could recuperate. That's why it's there. Not that man was there for the Sabbath. So Jeremy, like you were bringing up, the Sabbath isn't, man is not there to honor the Sabbath. Like, that's not the purpose of man. I mean, man wasn't created just to do X, Y, and Z on the Sabbath day, like you were bringing up, Jeremy. And then Jake and Paul, you guys brought up this idea of the Pharisees just adding all these extra things around a blessing from God to turn it into this weird, convoluted law. And then what's really cool is that last statement that, so the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath. So Jesus is saying Jesus, the Son of Man, is Lord even on the Sabbath. That the Sabbath, that day of rest, was for us. When is God God?
Always.
Always. Yeah. So Jeremy, you brought up that time of worship. Well, could we worship on a Monday night rather than a Sunday morning? Or for the Old Testament, could they worship on a Thursday afternoon rather than a Saturday?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, he's Lord every day, and the Sabbath, that day of rest, he's even Lord there. But that day of rest is that opportunity for your body to be filled, to your body to be restored. I know, just because I know you guys, some of you, for me to be filled up means I need nothing to do. I want to sit around. I don't want to have to do anything. For some of you, it's I want to go play frisbee golf, Dom. That's kind of that renewing, refreshing thing. Jeremy, I mean, you guys, I want to go for a run. I want to go play flag football. You guys do all sorts of stuff. Not because it's a task, but because that's a plenishing, kind of restoring you kind of thing. Like Mike brought up, that body and that soul. But then the flip side is that, so when do we worship? Well, it's not just the Sabbath. We worship kind of perpetually, because when is God God?
All the time.
Always. Yeah. All right. So we're coming up on our time. I know we only went through one chapter. But next week we'll move a little faster next week. But I wanted to anyone have questions or things that came up as we were very quickly kind of going through chapter 2?
I felt a little weird. I didn't really know what Pharisees were, so I
Yeah.
looked them up. So I was just kind of curious what it was.
Yes. Well, no, I think that's a great point. So
I looked it
the Old
up. It was said a religious group made mostly of middle-class men. That's
that's a great starting point. The Old Testament, there aren't any Pharisees. That's not a group of people. The New Testament, all of a sudden, there are these Pharisees. Well, between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, there's about 400 years, chronological time. And in that 400-year period, that was, you had Alexander the Great and the Macedonians come in. Then you had the Ptolemies come in up out of Egypt after Alexander. Then you had the Roman Empire come in. You had the Maccabean revolt in Judea. And so all these big major things happened. And yet in the midst of it, they had sort of lost what it is to be an Israelite, what it is to be a Jewish person. And that's also the time where they start to get called Jews, because you had what was left were the Judeans, the tribe of Judah, the Judeans. So they started to get called the Jews because of that. So that's where that name comes from. But Dominic, it was that they had lost their identity. So there was a collection that said, we need to regain who we are as God's people. And so they started really digging in again into those laws of God so they could follow and live as God's people. So it started off as a great thing, saying, let's get back to God. But then by the time Jesus came around, the pendulum had swung really far over here. And now it had become these guys trying to say, we're the religious elite. We're the really special religious people.
It kind of helps. It gives me kind of like a mental picture. When I read Pharisees, I kind of have an idea of what they are. I didn't know if I was supposed to know it or not, but I really didn't, so I looked it up.
Well, and it's not a term that, I mean, we don't have Pharisees today. We don't have, that's great that you looked it up. Anyone else have questions or things that you guys learned when you were reading for today?
Mm-hmm.
I went back in the what is it, the Gospel for You podcast? Is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. And I found a podcast from 3 years ago where Pastor Heimsoft spoke about this chapter.
Okay.
So I listened to that, and it was nice to hear him speak on it also, and kind of go over it that way.
Good. Yeah, that was a good. When we went through Mark, that was some of the different guys who spoke during that really, really dug into the different things going on. So it was a great use of a tool, Mike. So Mike's talking about the gospel for you. It's a podcast that the circuit pastors do. Jeff Wade, who's a pastor at St. John's Waltz, and myself have become the hosts of the show, but it started off with more of us. But we went through the whole Gospel of Mark. So if you're a podcast kind of person, you can go listen to some of that if you want.
We can't go to sleep. Let's wake up.
All right. Well, would anyone like to end us in prayer today? So Jake,
I'll do it.
All right, go for it, Mike.
All right. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us to get together and discuss your word.
Sorry.
He disappeared.
It was it was a really short prayer.
That was a real. Thank you, God, for letting us discuss your word. It's still a good prayer, though. I think his daughter hung up on it or clicked off on it. So, all right. Well, you guys, I do want to share whenever it is possible. We'll get together. We'll actually do this Bible study maybe in person and have a beer or something while we're doing it. So. Well, you guys have a great night, Paul. Sorry, you only got a few minutes of it, but
Yeah. I'm glad to get a little bit though. I mean, this is fun.
good. So should we all get off right as he's getting back on, or? I don't know. Maybe he's not going to get back on. All right. Well, as Mike's getting back on, if you guys want to check off, I hope you guys have a great week. I'll talk to you all later then.
Did you want us to read anything for next week? I got
we're gonna,
chapter 3.
Yeah, let's look at 3 and 4.
Okay.
Right on.
Sound good?
Yep.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
See you
All
guys.
See you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you. See you.